Subscribe to Love, Lies, and Cheating. Now let me tell you a story. I used to believe that motherhood was a moment, a clean dividing line between before and after. But the truth is, it begins the first time your body learns a name before your mouth ever speaks it. It begins in the quiet weeks when everyone around you still treats you like a person with options while you are already becoming a person with a single focus. And then, if you are unlucky, it begins again in a second moment that no one warns you about. The moment you realize you can have a child and still be powerless to keep them. The room was too bright when I gave birth. Not warm bright like morning, but clinical bright like interrogation. And I remember thinking that the lights made everything feel unreal, as if I could wake up and find myself back in the world where I still had time to decide what came next. And there were voices around me calling me brave and calling me strong and telling me to breathe as if breath alone could guarantee anything. I had made a plan the way people make plans when they are frightened but trying to be responsible. I told myself it was temporary and careful and controlled. I told myself I could do what was necessary without losing what mattered. And I told myself that if I kept my head down and followed instructions, then the world would meet me in the middle. That was the first mistake. Because institutions do not meet you in the middle, families do not meet you in the middle when fear is involved, and men with paperwork in their hands never meet you in the middle. They step over the line while you are still trying to understand where the line moved. I remember the first form they placed in front of me. It looked harmless. A page with boxes and blank lines and language that sounded like routine. And I remember how tired I was, how my hands shook when I tried to hold a pen, how the nurse spoke softly the way people do when they want you to comply. And I signed because I believed signing was part of the process that brought me closer to my child rather than farther away. Later I learned that signatures can be used as ropes, not to pull you into safety, but to pull you out of the room while everyone insists you walk there yourself. My sister was there too. Not in the delivery room at the end, but close enough to feel like a presence. Close enough that I could tell myself I was not alone. And when she came in afterward, her face looked like a mask of concern placed carefully over something else, something heavier, something that had already decided what it would allow. She sat on the edge of the chair and held my hand and told me everything would be fine. She told me I was doing the right thing. She told me I was brave again, and she used the word temporary like it was a blanket she could tuck around me. But temporary means nothing if you are not the one controlling time. I asked to see the baby again, and they brought her to me wrapped in a blanket so tight she looked like a promise someone was trying to contain, and when I touched her cheek, she turned her head slightly as if she knew my hand, and the simplicity of that recognition made me feel both relieved and terrified. Because recognition is the most fragile thing in the world when other people are deciding what counts as real. The first time I said I changed my mind, I expected it to be treated like a human moment, the way people treat any decision made after trauma and exhaustion. I expected someone to say, "Okay, let us slow down, let us talk, let us make sure you are clear." But instead, the nurse's face tightened, not in anger, but in discomfort. And she said that paperwork had already been started and that I should speak with someone in administration, as if my child was already a file moving through a system that could not stop just because I found my voice. Administration is a word that sounds neutral until it is the door between you and what you need. A man came in later with a folder and spoke to me like someone correcting a mistake, not a woman grieving a decision she did not fully understand. And he explained that these processes were complicated, that family arrangements were sensitive, that stress makes people impulsive. And then he used the first phrase that would later follow me for years. For your own good. As soon as someone says for your own good, you should understand they have stopped hearing you because the phrase is not information. It is a lock. It closes the conversation while pretending it is offering protection. My sister asked me to rest. My sister asked me to trust her. My sister asked me not to make this harder than it had to be. And I looked at her and realized in a quiet, terrifying way that she was not asking what I wanted. She was asking me to accept what she needed. She needed stability. She needed certainty. She needed a solution that would not touch her reputation or her marriage or her future. And in her mind, the baby was both a gift and a problem to be managed, and as long as she could convince herself she was saving me from myself, she could act without guilt. That is how people become villains without ever calling themselves cruel. The next day, they moved me to a different room and told me it was routine, and I watched the hallway from the bed like it might deliver the sound of my child's cry back to me. But the hallway stayed quiet, and the nurses avoided my eyes. And when I asked where she was, they answered in sentences that had no shape. They said she was with family. They said she was being cared for. They said she was safe. And the more they insisted on safety, the more I understood that safety was being used as a substitute for consent. When I demanded to see my paperwork, they said it was being processed. When I demanded to speak with someone in charge, they said he was unavailable. And when I raised my voice, my sister's expression changed again, not into anger, but into something like pity, the kind of pity that makes you feel smaller because it paints you as irrational. She asked me if I was feeling okay. She asked me if the pain medication was making me confused, and then she said the word I would come to hate more than any other. Unstable. She did not say it harshly. She said it softly as if she was concerned, but I understood immediately what it did. Because the moment a woman is labeled unstable, her words become noise and the people around her begin speaking about her instead of to her. And I watched that shift happen in real time. Watched the nurse glance at my sister for confirmation. Watched the man with the folder take notes without looking at me. I knew then that the story was being written without my input. I left the hospital with my body sore and my arms empty, and everyone pretending that what I felt was temporary, that grief would fade, that I would be relieved later, and maybe in another life that would have been true. But in the life I was living, the absence did not fade. It sharpened. I went home, and the silence in my apartment felt loud. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own thoughts like accusations, and I began calling numbers. The hospital, the agency, the lawyer my sister provided with a name she spoke like a favor, and every call ended the same way with a polite tone and a refusal dressed as procedure. We cannot release that information. That file is sealed. That decision is final. Those phrases do not feel cruel until they are directed at the most personal thing you have ever held. The lawyer met with me once and spoke with the calm of someone who believed time would solve my distress, and he explained that my sister and her husband were offering stability and love and resources, and that I should be grateful. And when I said I did not give my child away to be a solution for someone else's life, he smiled slightly and told me I was emotional, as if emotion disqualified truth. I asked where my signature was on the final consent. He said it existed. I asked to see it. He said it was on file. I asked what date it was signed. He gave a date that did not match what I remembered, and when I pressed him, he said dates can reflect processing times. A phrase that sounded like nonsense until I realized it was a way to blur accountability. Because if dates are flexible, then responsibility becomes flexible too. My sister stopped answering my calls after a while. And when she did answer, she spoke in a tone that implied I was harming myself by insisting on what I had lost. She told me to move forward. She told me to focus on my life. She told me not to fixate, and that was the moment I understood the second truth about this kind of loss. People do not like the person who remembers. They prefer the person who heals quietly and disappears. I started keeping notes because my memory felt like it was being challenged every time I spoke. I wrote down names and dates and phrases. I wrote down the way the nurse looked at my sister before answering. I wrote down the date the lawyer claimed my consent was signed, and I wrote down the moment my sister said unstable, because I knew one day I would need to prove that the story had been shaped by language as much as by paperwork. For months, I believed if I just found the right person in the right office, I could correct the record. I believed the system had a door somewhere for truth, and I did not yet understand that systems are built to protect themselves first. And if your truth threatens a clean outcome, they call your truth a complication. One afternoon, I went to the county office and requested my own records under a different pretense, and I found small inconsistencies that no one would care about unless they were searching. Numbers out of sequence, stamps that looked like they were applied later. A missing witness signature on one form that was apparently acceptable because no one expected the biological mother to challenge anything. It would have been almost impressive if it had not been my life. That was when the feeling in me changed from frantic to focused, because if I could not win through confrontation, then I would win through patience, and I would build a record that could survive my exhaustion, because the one thing I still owned was time, and if I could not hold my child in my arms, then I would hold the truth until it had nowhere left to hide. I started writing letters, not to my sister, not to the lawyer, to the child. I wrote them as if one day she would read them and understand that she was wanted, not in an abstract way, but in the specific aching way a mother knows. And I wrote them without sending, because sending would have been blocked. Sending would have been intercepted. Sending would have allowed them to frame me as disruptive again, and I needed my words to remain untouched. So, I kept them. I watched from a distance when I could, small glimpses that felt both nourishing and cruel. A stroller in a park, a family photo someone displayed in a shop window when a local photographer promoted a session, a school recital listing names I had no right to claim publicly. And each time I saw her, it confirmed what I already knew, that she was real, and she was mine, and she was growing in a world that would call me a shadow. I learned to survive as a shadow. But I did not learn to stop being her mother. And that is where my story truly begins. Not in the hospital and not in the lawyer's office, but in the decision to wait, to document, and to plan for the only moment that could not be sealed. The moment after I was gone. The months that followed taught me something I had not understood before, which is that systems do not need to be loud to be effective. They simply need to be consistent, because every time I called and was told the same polite refusal, and every time a letter arrived repeating the same carefully chosen language, I felt my resolve tested not by confrontation, but by repetition. At first, I still believed persistence would be rewarded, that if I showed up enough times and spoke calmly enough and proved that I was rational and stable and clear, then someone would eventually acknowledge that a mistake had been made. But instead, I learned that clarity only made me easier to manage. Because once they understood I would not explode, they no longer feared me. And without fear, there was no incentive to listen. My sister stopped framing her silence as temporary and began treating it as permanent. And when I finally saw her in person at a family gathering, she spoke to me like someone addressing a distant relative rather than a sister, asking about my work and my apartment and anything that did not touch the one subject that filled every quiet space in my life. And when I tried to bring it up, she said softly, "Not here," as if the setting mattered more than the truth. I watched her build a life that looked complete from the outside, and I understood that completeness requires editing. That in order for her story to make sense, I had to be removed from it. And once I accepted that her version of peace depended on my absence, I stopped expecting her to help me reclaim anything. The lawyer sent one final letter stating that further contact would be considered harassment, a word that felt almost absurd considering what had been taken. But I recognized the tactic immediately, because harassment is the label applied when persistence becomes inconvenient, and it allowed them to threaten consequences without addressing the substance of my claim. That was the moment I stopped reaching outward. Instead, I began turning inward and backward and forward all at once, mapping what had happened not as a series of injustices but as a process, identifying where the power shifted and where language replaced consent. Because if I could not undo the outcome, I could at least understand how it had been constructed. I learned which offices spoke to which lawyers and which signatures appeared repeatedly on unrelated documents. I learned how easily timelines could be softened by vague wording, and how often sealed files were treated as solutions rather than safeguards. And slowly the shape of it became clear to me. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but a collaboration of convenience where everyone did their small part, and no one felt responsible for the whole. During this time, I learned how to live with the absence in practical ways, how to move through grocery stores without staring at children who shared my hair color, how to sit through holidays without imagining who should have been there, and how to smile politely when people told me I was lucky to be unburdened, a phrase that made me feel as though they were congratulating me for surviving a storm they did not believe existed. I kept my letters carefully dated and stored because they were the only place I allowed myself to speak freely. And in them, I did not explain or justify or argue. I simply described my days and my thoughts, and the quiet hope that someday they would be read by the person they were meant for. Because hope is harder to erase than anger, and I needed something durable. Years passed this way, and with them came a strange kind of clarity, because distance stripped away the urgency and left behind understanding. And I realized that what had happened to me was not unique or even particularly shocking. It was simply invisible. The kind of story that survives because it does not announce itself loudly enough to be challenged. I also realized that time worked differently for me now, because while others used it to forget, I used it to prepare, and preparation does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like patience and routine and quiet observation. It looks like a woman who lives an ordinary life while holding a plan she does not yet need. I did not know exactly how I would reclaim my place in my child's story, but I knew it would not happen through argument or exposure or forgiveness, because those all require cooperation. And cooperation was the one thing I had been denied from the beginning. What I did know was that I still had my name, and that names have power long after voices are ignored. And once that thought settled in me, it did not leave. It followed me through my days and reshaped how I understood my future. Because if I could not be present, then I could at least be recorded. And that was when I began thinking not about reconciliation, but about recognition. not about fixing what had been taken, but about ensuring it could not be erased completely. Because there are moments in life when the only control you have left is over how the truth enters the room. Watching from a distance is a skill you do not choose but learn through necessity. And once I accepted that proximity was no longer an option, I trained myself to notice without intruding, to be present without being visible, to let my love exist quietly in the margins where it could not be challenged or removed. I learned the rhythms of her life without touching it, the seasons marked by changes in height and posture rather than birthdays I was not invited to, the way children grow into themselves first awkwardly and then with confidence. And each year confirmed what I'd always known, which was that she was thriving in ways that did not require my presence to be real. I attended events the way strangers do, standing at the back or sitting near exits, choosing places where I could leave without being remembered. And I told myself that this was enough because enough is sometimes the only word that keeps you standing, and because wanting more would have meant risking everything I had managed to preserve. There were moments when I almost stepped forward, moments when instinct screamed louder than reason, and I imagined saying my name and watching recognition spread across her face. But I had learned what systems do to women who disrupt outcomes they did not authorize. And I knew that one unplanned moment could be used to rewrite me again as unstable or intrusive or dangerous. So I stayed still. I collected what could not be taken from me, observations instead of access, memory instead of proof. And I wrote everything down not to build a case, but to keep myself anchored. Because when you are denied validation long enough, you begin to doubt your own clarity. And writing became a way to remind myself that what I experienced was real. I noticed patterns in how information traveled, how photographs appeared online briefly before being removed, how school newsletters used language that revealed more than they intended, how people spoke when they assumed no one important was listening. And each small detail reinforced the same truth, which was that my absence had been carefully managed but never fully secured. Time softened some edges but sharpened others, because while the urgency faded, the permanence grew clearer, and I understood that my role would never be restored through action alone. It would require a moment that changed the narrative itself, something that did not ask permission or invite debate. That understanding arrived gradually, not as inspiration, but as resignation transformed into clarity. Because resignation accepts loss, while clarity decides how loss will be remembered. And I realized that my life did not need to end in silence simply because my voice had been excluded. I stopped writing letters that asked questions and began writing letters that stated facts, not accusations, but truths, names and dates and relationships written plainly without emotion, because facts endure longer than feelings, and I wanted something that could survive scrutiny when I could not. I also began organizing my affairs with a new intention, choosing language carefully in documents that most people treat casually, understanding that legal wording can be both a weapon and a shield depending on who controls it. And I took quiet satisfaction in knowing that I could still shape one outcome without interference. The thought of death did not frighten me the way it once had, not because I wanted it, but because it represented a boundary no one could cross to stop me. A moment when my choices would finally be executed without revision or interpretation. And that realization settled into me like a steady calm. I imagined the moment not as confrontation, but as interruption, a pause in someone else's certainty, a disruption gentle enough to avoid retaliation, but firm enough to demand acknowledgement. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that recognition did not require explanation if it arrived at the right time. I was not planning revenge or exposure or punishment. I was planning presence, the kind that cannot be argued away once it has been named publicly. And that distinction mattered because it kept me from becoming consumed by bitterness, allowing me to remain focused on the one thing that had always mattered, that my child would know I existed. That knowledge shaped everything that followed, from how I stored my letters to how I chose witnesses who would not understand the full story but would carry its surface forward. And I accepted that I would not be there to see the result, because seeing it was never the goal. Being known was. Planning the end of your life is a strange kind of freedom because it strips away the illusion that there will always be more time to explain yourself. And once that illusion is gone, decisions become simpler, not easier but clearer. Because you are no longer negotiating with hope, you are working with certainty. I did not rush the planning, and I did not dramatize it because drama invites interference. Instead, I treated it the way I treated everything else in those years, quietly, methodically, and without inviting commentary, making choices that looked ordinary on the surface and purposeful only if someone knew where to look. I reviewed documents I had signed long ago and rewrote the ones that allowed it, learning which forms could be changed without consent from anyone else and which could not. And I paid special attention to the language that most people skim past because language is where authority hides, especially when people assume it is harmless. Choosing next of kin was not an emotional decision the way people imagine it. It was practical and deliberate. Because next of kin is not just a label. It is a position of recognition, a public acknowledgement that cannot be ignored once spoken aloud. And I understood that while my voice had been dismissed in private, my name still carried weight in official spaces. I did not leave explanations behind in places where they could be intercepted or softened. I left facts where they would be read aloud without commentary, trusting that the absence of explanation would be more unsettling than any accusation I could write, because unanswered questions linger longer than resolved ones. I arranged my affairs so that no one needed to contact my sister for clarification, no one needed to verify intentions, and no one could reroute responsibility quietly, because the goal was not to start a conversation, but to create a moment that required acknowledgement without debate. I chose the funeral home carefully, not because of aesthetics, but because of their procedures, understanding which organizations follow instructions strictly and which allow families to revise details at the last minute. And I selected one that valued paperwork over preference because paperwork does not flinch. I wrote letters again during this time, but they were different from the ones before, not filled with longing or explanation, but with acceptance, a recognition that love does not require proximity and that motherhood does not expire simply because it has been denied expression. And I addressed them not as pleas, but as statements meant to stand on their own. I did not tell anyone what I was planning because secrecy was not about deception. It was about preservation, because the fewer people involved, the fewer opportunities there were for interference. And interference had been the defining feature of my life for too long. As my health declined, the urgency did not come from fear, but from timing, because I wanted the moment to arrive while people still remembered my name well enough to be unsettled by it, while relationships were intact enough to feel the interruption, and while the truth could not be dismissed as the confusion of someone already forgotten. I thought often about how it would feel for her to sit in that room and hear her name spoken in a context she did not expect. And I hoped not for shock, but for curiosity, because curiosity opens doors that anger slams shut, and I trusted her capacity to follow questions where they led. I did not expect forgiveness, and I did not design the moment to demand it, because forgiveness belongs to the living, and I would not be there to receive it. But recognition is not a transaction, it is an acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement was the only thing I had been denied consistently. In those final months, I found peace not in resolution but in preparation, knowing that the story would not end with me disappearing quietly, knowing that my existence would interrupt the narrative one last time in a way that could not be revised or sealed or reframed as instability. The funeral would not explain anything. It would simply state a fact. And facts have a way of changing everything once they are spoken aloud. The moment itself arrived without ceremony for me because I was no longer there to witness it. And yet I had imagined it so many times that it felt familiar even in absence. The room, the quiet, the pause before names are spoken, and the way people lean forward when they sense something is about to matter. I knew how these services worked, and I knew the rhythm of them well enough to trust that the words would land as intended, that next of kin would not be whispered or softened or explained away, but spoken plainly the way official facts are spoken. And that plainness would do the work I could not do while alive. I imagined her standing there unsure of whether she belonged, and I imagined the shift that would happen when uncertainty gave way to recognition. Not emotional recognition, but structural recognition, the kind that forces questions rather than answers. And I trusted her to do what I had done all those years ago, which was to listen closely when things stopped making sense. I did not leave instructions about what anyone should feel because feelings are not controllable, and trying to shape them would have been another form of interference. Instead, I left the truth intact and allowed it to arrive without commentary, knowing that the absence of explanation would demand investigation rather than closure. People would talk afterward the way they always do, piecing together fragments, sharing assumptions, correcting one another, and unknowingly carrying the story forward simply by being unsettled by it. And in that unsettled space, something important would happen, because silence would no longer be possible without effort. I accepted that my sister would be confronted not publicly but privately by the knowledge that what she believed she had contained had found another path into the open, and that her certainty would fracture not because she was accused, but because she was recognized as part of a story she could no longer control. I accepted that there would be anger and confusion and defensiveness, and that none of those reactions were mine to manage anymore, because the moment had passed where I was responsible for keeping other people comfortable at my own expense, and comfort had never been part of truth anyway. What mattered was that my child would now know that the story she lived inside had another beginning, that her life did not emerge fully formed and unquestioned, but was shaped by choices that could be examined rather than accepted as fate, and that knowledge would belong to her alone to interpret. I did not expect gratitude or reconciliation or even understanding, because those things require timing and trust, and I was no longer part of either. But recognition does not need permission once it has been granted, and that was the gift I left behind. In the quiet after the service, when people returned to their routines and the room emptied and my name lingered briefly before fading, I knew that something had shifted not dramatically, but permanently. Because truth, once introduced, cannot be unintroduced even if people try. The interruption had been made, and interruption was enough. What remains after recognition is quieter than people expect, because there is no explosion, no confrontation, no moment where everything is resolved neatly. There is only the slow rearranging of understanding as the truth settles into places where it had never been allowed before. I imagine her leaving the service with more questions than answers, and I'm at peace with that, because questions are movement and movement is life. And I never wanted to hand her certainty wrapped in my own interpretation. I wanted to give her the freedom to decide what the truth meant for her without anyone else guiding the outcome. The truth does not erase the years that passed without me, and it does not undo the choices that shaped her childhood. But it does something quieter and more enduring, which is that it restores context. And context allows a person to understand themselves without blaming fate or flaw for what was always structural. I do not imagine her rejecting the people who raised her or rewriting her life in anger, because love is not a limited resource, and understanding does not require destruction. Instead, I imagine her holding multiple truths at once, learning that belonging is complex and that identity is layered rather than singular. My sister will carry her own reckoning whether she acknowledges it aloud or not, because once a story has been interrupted, it cannot return to its original shape. And even silence becomes a choice rather than an accident. And that knowledge changes how people move through their lives, whether they admit it or not. I do not imagine forgiveness arriving easily or quickly, and I do not require it, because forgiveness is not proof of understanding. Sometimes understanding arrives without reconciliation, and that too is a form of truth, one that allows people to live forward without pretending the past was simple. What matters to me is not how anyone explains what happened, but that it is no longer hidden, that my existence is no longer optional or dismissible or framed as instability, that it is acknowledged as part of the foundation rather than an inconvenience edited out for comfort. I was never asking to be restored to a place in her daily life or to reclaim moments already lived without me. I was asking for recognition that my role existed at all. And in that sense, the funeral was not an ending but a beginning. Not for me, but for her. The truth will not demand anything of her, and that was always important to me, because love that demands is not love but ownership, and I never wanted to replace one form of control with another. I wanted only to remove the lie that said I had vanished by choice. I imagine her standing somewhere later, perhaps alone, perhaps not, and realizing that the story she inherited has depth rather than gaps, that the unanswered questions were not evidence of something missing but of something deliberately withheld, and that realization may hurt, but it will also strengthen her. I did not leave her instructions for what to do next, because life is not something that should be directed from the past. And the final act of love I could offer was restraint, the refusal to shape her response even in absence. What I leave behind instead is space. Space for her to understand herself more fully. Space for truth to exist without apology. Space for a story that no longer requires silence to survive. That is all I ever wanted. Don't forget to subscribe to Love, Lies, and Cheating. Until we meet again.